Hello, everybody, and thank you for watching. My name is Mary Moynihan, and I'm a writer, poet, theatre and filmmaker, and artistic director of the Smashing Times International Centre for the Arts and Equality. And I'm artistic curator for our annual Dublin Art and Human Rights Festival, supported by the Arts Council. And it's my pleasure and honour to interview Sally Hayden, an award-winning journalist and photographer whose work focuses on migration, conflict and humanitarian crisis. Sally is the author of My Fourth Time We Drowned, an extraordinary award-winning book that I recommend we all read. The book depicts how the treatment of refugees today has become one of the most devastating human rights disasters in our history. And it tells stories of people making the impossible choices and unimaginable journeys to freedom, and of the system that wants them to be silent and disappear. I think the book acts as a witness to the experiences of people seeking refuge on the world's deadliest migration routes. And as described in the book, is a shocking and harrowing account of the personal stories of refugees seeking sanctuary as they attempt to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. The book outlines the atrocities, corruption, and the human rights abuses that so many people are subjected to in so-called legitimate detention centres, as well as the appalling impact of failed European migration policies. And we are delighted, and we thank you, Sally, for accepting our invitation. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful book, written very compassionately, and we're delighted to have you here today to talk about the book and your work as a journalist. So
thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I wanted to ask you, because you write in the book that you began reporting on migration and refugee experiences in 2015. And that's the year that more than 1 million people crossed the Mediterranean Sea into Europe. And in terms of figures, since then, it is believed that over 25,000 people have drowned or gone missing in the Mediterranean Sea, which is almost 1,500 to 2,000 people who are drowning each year, trying to cross the central Mediterranean. So in the context of those facts and those atrocities, I wanted to ask you what inspired you to write this incredible book.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Yeah, I think initially I started reporting on migration. I was like a general assignment reporter based in London for Vice News. And it wasn't that I specifically went out of my way to report on it. It was just that that was the big story at the time. And particularly because I was in London, we were hearing a lot of rhetoric from then Prime Minister David Cameron, who said things like swarms of migrants are trying to get to the UK from Calais in France. And I ended up going over to Calais to report in 2015, and basically realizing that the kind of rhetoric that we hear from politicians, it's like really diminishing. It wasn't really conveying the reality of like who these people were or why they were trying to cross in these, dangerous manners. And what I met was people who had fled a huge range of different situations: wars, dictatorships, crushing poverty. A lot had like very understandable reasons for trying to get to the UK, that they had family members there, or that they spoke English, that they came from former British colonies. And they that kind of made me realize that there was a lot that wasn't being understood or wasn't being covered. And from there, I ended up meeting so many people who I stayed in touch with, who would then give me tips of different stories that were worth covering, of different things that were being misunderstood about this situation. And, it's not that you necessarily decide that you want to report on something completely. It's more that as a journalist, you'll start getting, you stay in communication with people and they send you information, and you find things that seem very important to report. And I ended up doing several big investigations into topics like what was happening to Syrian refugees who tried to return to Syria. And we revealed that some were being arrested on arrival, detained and tortured. And that investigation was then used in various legal challenges and had quite a big impact. And then I did another investigation into the UN Refugee Agency in Sudan, and allegations that the kind of legal refugee resettlement route had been marred by corruption. And that investigation ended up 2 days after my investigation on that was published in 2017. the resettlement program was suspended pending an internal investigation, and one staff member in the UN Refugee Agency was then found guilty of soliciting bribes and abusing power. And I had continued reporting. At this time I was freelance, and the book starts with a message that I received from refugees who were locked up in a Libyan migrant detention center. So Libya is neighboring Sudan, and they had basically tried to cross the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. They had been caught at sea, forced back to Libya, and locked up indefinitely. And they had this hidden phone that they used to contact me and just say that they were desperate. They needed help because a war had broken out around them, and they had been abandoned by the guards who had been locking them inside, and they'd been left without food or water. They were worried that they could be sold back to traffickers. And I basically began communicating first with them and then with many, many other people who were locked up in many different detention centers that were in Libya. And it wasn't that I set out to write a book. Actually, like, I didn't have any idea that this would become a book. I first started posting these messages on Twitter as screenshots because I was trying to communicate the reality that this was happening. And I was in touch with people who were in a life or death situation who were desperately looking for help. And first I was posting them on screenshots, then I was doing media reports. Over the next year, I think I reported for pretty much everyone you can imagine. The Irish Times, the New York Times, CNN, Al Jazeera, Channel 4 News, ITV News, many different people or many different outlets. And eventually I realized I had gathered such a mass of information that was really, really damning to, about European migration policy and more generally to the broader, situation. And I put that together in the book.
And it is an extraordinary book, and there's so many elements to the book because, you mentioned the personal stories, and I think that's really important that, there are people involved, and the humanity of those people and the stories that are told are profoundly shocking. But also shocking then on the other side, like you were saying, is how European funding policies are being used to prop up, for example, the possibility of funding from Europe being propping up the detention centres, legal detention centres where people are experiencing torture and all sorts of abuses. And also the inability, or so it seems, by certain agencies, like you've mentioned, to actually do anything genuine on the ground for the people. And you kind of have touched on it, but again, when researching the book, what were the discoveries that shocked or affected you the most?
So I think when I initially started getting these messages, I kind of vaguely knew what was happening in Libya, but it's very different when you're in direct communication with somebody who's experiencing that themselves. And I think that kind of initially shocked me into action, just the fact that these were like the first people who contacted me. They were among 500 men, women, and children. There were children there that I could hear crying on voice notes. There were pregnant women, and they were in literally a life or death, or potentially anyway, a life or death situation, and they needed help. So of course you will respond to that. But then as I spoke to them more and more, it became clear that actually they were in this situation as a direct result of European Union migration policy. And that, so to kind of explain it very briefly, and obviously everything I say is explained much better in the book, what has been happening since 2017 is that in a bid to try and stop people from reaching European territory, the EU has been doing what's basically a circumnavigation of international law. So they conduct surveillance, flying drones, helicopters, planes above the central Mediterranean, looking for boats of refugees and migrants. But they also support the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept those boats. So since 2017, more than 122,000 men, women, and children have been caught like that, forced back to Libya. And when they get back to Libya, they're generally locked up indefinitely in detention centers that have been compared to concentration camps by Pope Francis, among others. And this is a circumnavigation of international law because a European vessel could not return people to Libya, but a Libyan vessel can, even if it's supported by Europe. And I think the shocking part for me was that I suddenly realized that this is being done in my name. So the reason that these people are in this situation is because of policy that is being acted out in my name. And that was basically what propelled me to keep reporting on this for years, like every day for years. And yeah, it really made it, because I think a lot of the time the kind of so-called migration crisis is portrayed as a situation, certainly in the Mediterranean, of European inaction, when actually it became quite clear to me that there's been prolonged and decisive action. And like, in terms of the reaction to the book, for example, it was cited in a submission to the International Criminal Court last year, calling for named European politicians to be investigated for crimes against humanity, because there's a lot of evidence now that crimes against humanity are taking place against those who are intercepted.
Yeah, because again, you do state that in the book about the International Criminal Court, saying that reports of arbitrary detention, unlawful killing, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, abduction for ransoms, extortion, all of this constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. So the fact that the EU, in a way, are contradicting what they supposedly stand for in terms of supporting human rights and respect and dignity for people, they're completely contravening that. And that is absolutely shocking. And, and you say it, in our name, it is happening. And, do you feel there's an onus on people, like, what can we do to stand up and to speak out against these atrocities? Because it's interesting in the book that you say history is written by the victors, and victims who survive often do not have the strength to stand up and rewrite the narrative, or they don't have the connections to make sure their voices are counted. So in a way, what you're doing is giving voice to these stories, which we need to hear. And what would you like people to take from the book in relation to that? How do we keep those stories center stage? How do we keep our empathy, and what can be done?
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me, I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist. I see my role as making sure that this information is available and making sure that people can't say that they don't know that this is happening. I think obviously it's on everybody to decide what they do with that information, if anything, but it's important to be clear, because I've spoken to a lot of European politicians and policymakers over the last few years. And when you speak to them, they will say they're doing what the electorate want. They say that these policies exist because of what their electorates want, that they don't want to get voted out at the next election, and that's why they're making these efforts to stop migration basically to Europe. And I think that there's been this disconnect between the European public and the human consequences of their policies, so that people don't actually have to be faced with what those human consequences are. And in terms of my book, I see it as at least like correcting that balance, making sure that the European public can actually see, at least, and I say this, obviously what's in my book is like a tiny tip of the iceberg in terms of what I received, and then that's a tiny tip of the iceberg in terms of what's actually happening. But at least it's making some effort to show the European public what actually is happening in our names. And yeah, I mean, I see that as important. Obviously, I'm just like one person. I can't do everything, but at least that's I guess the role of journalism, to try and do that.
Yeah, and it's very important, and it's almost acting as a to form of witness, because I think the idea of that stories are a powerful thing. You wrote that, and there's a real need to have these stories told, and as you say, not just to tell them, but to enable people to keep telling them and to keep this center stage, because again, we keep seeing those who are privileged and what they have compared to those who are not, between and the importance of us paying attention to these stories of ordinary people and the atrocities that are happening. And I suppose it is that sense of, can writers make change? It's what we're about in the Arts and Human Rights Festival, the idea of artists for human rights. And when you say that politicians say that this is not relevant to ordinary people on the ground, I suppose telling the personal stories is the way we can try and impact on people. And I think that that's something that's extraordinary in the book. And the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is very interesting, is when the war in Ukraine happened, that the European Union were able to, in a way, open the doors and bring into effect some policy directives where they were able to fast track residency for Ukrainian refugees, rightly so. But why can't that be done for all refugees? And why is that happening? And is that a form of racism that, again, is being done in our name? And obviously that's something that needs to be looked at within the EU.
Yeah, I think that, like, obviously what's happening in Ukraine is absolutely horrific. And when Ukrainians were welcomed into Europe after that conflict started, like, it was surprising for a lot of the journalists who have been reporting on abuses on Europe's borders, and also heartening. Like, I spoke to one journalist who was saying maybe this means that things are going to get better overall. You know, actually, for years we've been told that more empathy is not possible, and maybe, you know, more empathy obviously was possible all along, but maybe that will be extended now. But others that I spoke to, for example, one guy who had escaped a dictatorship in Eritrea and come through a very, very traumatizing and lengthy route to Europe, said he just sees it as racism, that it was actually quite confronting and upsetting to see the different reactions. I think it's very interesting to compare the numbers. In Ukraine, so I'm going to get this wrong, but basically, in 2015, I know that 1.3 million people claimed asylum in Europe or in the EU, and that was the year of the so-called European migrant crisis. That was what kind of like kickstarted a lot of this very damaging anti-migration policy, you know, that has led to gross human rights abuses. But when you compare that 1.3 million to the amount of Ukrainians have come in, I can't remember the exact figure, but I know in the first around 10 days, it was multiples of that. And it's just, the comparison is interesting, you know, what was called a crisis and how that was reacted to. And yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but.
Well, it does, because I think what it's doing is highlighting the fact that, you know, a lot of the time what's at play is the idea of privilege and is the idea of political gain, where human lives are being lost. And, you know, what we need to do, or I suppose, you know, my own belief is that human rights are so important to us, that everybody understands the idea of wanting to be treated with dignity and respect. And if that applies to one person, it applies to all people. And in a way, I feel in society, we need more focus on values in society around human rights and around equality. And I think that's, Sally, what your book is doing in a way. It's highlighting so many atrocities, but also injustices, but also giving us those personal stories of real people. And I think that's really, really important. It's very moving. And you actually say it yourself that as a journalist, shining a light can lead to small change, even if there are no structural shifts. And I often think that even that small change can be like a ripple in the sea, which might lead to something bigger. So hopefully that people will read the book. And again, just to maybe finish up, what would you hope that people do take away from reading it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously everyone can take away whatever they want from reading it, I guess. I might hope for more empathy, but it's important to stress as well. I know that, like, this is a topic that people don't want to read about, and I just find it vitally important that they do. I think that, like, yeah, I don't even know how to explain this without like sounding trite. Like, we have a situation now where like mass drowning is happening on our borders, like more than 28,000 people dead in the Mediterranean since 2014. That's become kind of normalized. People just click away now when they see headlines that say that there's been another shipwreck. That's like, you know, probably very small scale compared to the people who are dying before they actually reach the Mediterranean. And like, yeah, as I said, I think that a lot of, you know, European policy is playing a role in this, and the rich world is playing a role in this, and that's on so many levels. For example, you know, climate change. Like, I was in Somalia twice last year, and there's a devastating drought there said to be caused by climate change, and the amount of emissions that Somalia releases is basically nothing And, you know, Ireland produces many, many times more emissions than Somalia, but they're the ones suffering. I was in one camp for displaced people where I counted 101 graves of children that were under the age of 8 who had died in the previous 2 months. I was in Niger before the coup, and there was again mass malnutrition. I interviewed women who had like starving babies who said that their husbands had gone and were trying to reach Europe because they felt that that was the only way that they could get money to support their children, to, you know, to be able to feed themselves. Again, that climate change was playing a role there. Many countries are former European colonies. Many countries have been exploited by the West for centuries, and that has played a role in the situations that they're now in, and that kind of gets lost in the discussion. And when we're talking about migration, I think that everything also needs to be framed in the sense that we have a global inequality crisis. So it's hard for us to, as Irish people who have, you know, a passport that enables us to travel quite freely, to imagine that many people just can't access visas, they can't get on planes, they have no other way to travel apart from this. This is why they're resorting to these means of transport. And yeah, I think that, yeah, this it's just an ongoing crisis for the people who are caught up in it. Not so much for Europe as for the people who are caught up in this. And yeah, I think I don't know how else to say that, but yeah, hopefully the book gives some awareness of that. But like I said, even since it came out, I've been reporting more and more. I was in Tunisia last month, meeting people who are escaping the what they're calling a genocide now in Darfur, who said that they had escaped, you know, their villages were set on fire, women were being raped, people were being slaughtered, they got away from that, they're now trying to cross the sea, they're aware that they might die in that journey, but they feel that they have no other option. And you meet people and you speak to them, and yeah, it's, I mean, obviously it's impossible for every European to have those direct communications potentially, but I do hope that at least a book gives people a little bit more understanding of that.
Well, I certainly think the book does. As I said, it's a wonderful book and very harrowing stories. But I think it's interesting when you talk about access to global smartphones and how something that we all take for granted here is a way that it's empowering people to tell their stories, if you like. And we have to keep telling those stories because it's, you know, and again, this is from the book about our present is constantly being shaped and refashioned by the powerful and wealthy. But the internet has given those traditionally excluded from these narratives a new way to fight back. And you write this line, which I think is very important, and I hope the world will start to listen to them. So hopefully that is the message that can go out, that people will read these stories and will listen. And you know, you actually quote Sophie Scholl at the beginning of your book. She was an anti-Nazi political activist. She was a young woman who stood up for the rights of others. And the quote is very interesting because it is about people who are silent when these things are happening. And perhaps there is an onus on all of us to listen and to hear these stories and to try and make some change in the world. So thank you so much for this wonderful book and for your work as a journalist. And we wish you the very best with your future work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much to you.